me this opportunity to discuss about severe dengue at a time when the cases are increasing all across the country. And this is one infection which has grown in incidence more than any other infection over the last 2 decades. It is notorious for that. So we will just see an overview of what are the things we should remember while managing children with severe dengue. So severe dengue, as we all know, has is one of these three categories. Plasma leakage, which is severe enough to cause dengue shock syndrome or respiratory distress, severe bleeding, or severe organ impairment. So each of these three categories have the word severe in it. So that means there may be mild variants of these problems, which do not necessarily mean that there is a uh, severe dengue in a patient. So we'll just go through a case scenario. A 5-year-old boy who has come with fever for 5 days and bleeding per rectum 2 episodes. And in the emergency, he is found to be tachypneic with a respiratory rate of 50 with retractions, tachycardia 148 per minute. Blood pressure is 100 by 80, CFT of 6 seconds, weak pulses and cold peripheries. He is drowsy and has periorbital puffiness. And he also has hepatomegaly. He's been referred with a hemoglobin of 16, platelets of 45,000, TLC of 3,500, and an NS1 rapid test that was positive. So there is no doubt that this child has dengue. And one thing to remember here is the blood pressure when we see a child in the emergency with suspected or proven dengue, not just hypotension, but it's important to recognize the narrow pulse pressure, which is a sign of increasing volume depletion. So the diastolic blood pressure will increase, the systolic will remain normal, and any pulse pressure of less than 20 is said to signify the presence of dengue shock syndrome and requires prompt fluid resuscitation. So this is a very important sign to recognize in the emergency department. And it's very important to know that our management has to follow the natural course of the disease. So one thing which we are very interested to know is what is the day of illness for that patient. So we all know that there is a febrile phase which can last anywhere between 2 to 7 days, a critical phase which lasts 24 to 48 hours or longer, and a recovery phase which again lasts 48 to 72 hours or longer. The unique pathophysiology or the natural course lies in the fact that during the critical phase, there is seepage of fluid into the extravascular tissues, that is third spacing, and all this fluid gradually returns back during the recovery phase. So these are the two phenomena which are associated with a lot of complications and take a lot of lives. The thing about these two phenomena are, one thing is that they are dynamic and they are unpredictable, and this is what probably makes dengue so uniquely difficult to manage sometimes. So in the critical phase, we are interested in only one thing: to manage the fluids and the replacement of plasma losses, as well as recognizing and treating hemorrhage early. And as the child moves over into the recovery phase, it's important to prevent fluid overload as well. So most of the time, we are just doing one job in this phase, that is a tightrope walk between treating shock and avoiding fluid overload and consequent ventilation need. So for this reason, the solution that is proposed is to aim for a minimal acceptable circulating volume. So compared to other types of shock or septic shock, our targets are different. The systolic blood pressure of just fifth centile is fine enough. The pulse pressure may widen to more than 30. Urine output of just zero point 0.5 ml per kg per hour is fine. And we want a gradual reduction in the elevated hematocrit. So some of the common errors that we should avoid are chasing blood pressure when other parameters are maintained, chasing urine output when it is above 0.5 ml per kg per hour, and especially important to remember that once the urine output is more than 1 or even 2, it is a sign that we need to stop fluids. That is also important to recognize. So the challenges here are to get the fluids just right in a resource limited setting where there can be poor primary care and late referrals and intensive care facilities may be unavailable is a big challenge. But on the brighter side, it has been seen that simple, inexpensive interventions can lead to successful outcomes with a very low mortality, provided we have early, appropriate, and commensurate clinical assessment with the disease process, exhibit a highest level of clinical judgment, and we have meticulous and continuous monitoring. So this is what is the bottom line for the management of severe dengue. So we are replacing what is already lost by giving initial rapid boluses and what is being lost by titrating fluid volumes and the normal maintenance. So around 30% of children with dengue require IV fluids, and it's very important to have a detailed flow chart with hourly monitoring of vital signs, fluid balance, and hematocrit. So these are some of the studies which we have heard many times, the debate between crystalloids and colloids. So the bottom line is crystalloids are equally effective and adequate for most children. Between saline and Ringer's lactate, Ringer lactate may lead to lactic acidosis, especially when there is hepatic involvement, so there it may be avoided. Otherwise, colloids can be used in severe dengue shock, but it has to be individualized. So coming back to this index child with compensated shock, we assess his ABC and get his hematocrit, start monitoring the urine output, and start fluid, say normal saline, 5 to 10 ml per kg per hour over the first hour. And then we assess the improvement, both as hemodynamics as well as the hematocrit. If both are improving, that is hemodynamics are stable, stabilized, and the hematocrit falls, then we can start gradually tapering this fluid infusion rate, say from 5 to 7 over the 1 to 2 hours, then 3 to 5 for the next 2 to 4 hours, and then 2 to 3 for next 2 to 4 hours, and then normal maintenance, and start oral fluids once his condition is better and there is no vomiting. So this kind of monitored fluid regimen will go on for at least 24 to 48 hours till we are sure that this child is out of the danger period, that is the critical phase. And then we eventually plan discharge. So this will be the approach to a patient who is presenting with compensated shock. On the other hand, if there is no improvement, we recheck the hematocrit. If it remains high and the signs of shock are unresolved, this means that he needs more fluid. We can administer a second bolus of a crystalloid or colloid, 10 to 20 ml per kg over 1 to 2 hours, depending on the blood pressures. And if there is improvement, we again start tapering the fluid infusion rate. But if there is no improvement, we check the hematocrit and the hemodynamics again. And especially if there is a drop in the hematocrit, it's important to consider giving blood transfusion if we are considering the possibility of a bleed. So essentially, we are just monitoring the hemodynamics and the hematocrit and titrating our fluids and deciding blood transfusion based on this. So if we have a high or an increasing hematocrit, this means that we need to increase the fluid rate. And once this starts coming down, we can just monitor closely. But if the hematocrit is dropping and the hemodynamics are unstable, this means that there may be an occult bleed which needs blood transfusion. On the other hand, if the hematocrit is decreasing, but the hemodynamics are stable, this means that we have to reduce or stop fluids. So it's essentially playing with these variables and deciding the next course of action. Coming to the next case scenario, a 7-month-old boy who's presenting with fever and lethargy. Today is the day 4 of illness. And at presentation in the emergency, is tachypneic again, heart rate of 160, BP of 60 by 30. That means he's hypotensive, prolonged CFT, weak pulses and cold peripheries, drowsy. He has periorbital puffiness, abdominal distension, and bleeding from the IV site. Hemoglobin is 14.1. Platelets are 28,000, TLC is 4,500. His coagulogram is also deranged. Both PT and APTT are prolonged, and liver enzymes are all quite high. And this is the X-ray. We can see the classical bilateral infiltrates as well as the haze on the right side, along with a pleural effusion, which is quite typical of dengue. So this child has come with hypotensive shock. We again get the ABCs and start monitoring the urine output. And this time we either give NS or RL or colloid, 10 to 20 ml per kg, 1 to 2 boluses over 15 to 30 minutes. So this is faster. And we again check for immediate reversible causes like a glucose and an ionized calcium. And then assess again both his hemodynamics as well as the hematocrit. So if there is a high baseline hematocrit, which is not improving, we can administer another bolus slightly over a longer period, over 1 to 2 hours, depending on the blood pressure. And if the hematocrit has dropped, or if the baseline hematocrit itself is low, we look for a source of bleeding and arrange for urgent blood transfusion. So again, based on hemodynamics and hematocrit, we either continue or come down on the fluids gradually. So this child was admitted to the PICU He received crystalloids followed by colloids. He was also given packed cells, FFP transfusion, as well as platelets. I'll discuss all of this one by one. So suppose this child, we have one kind of scenario where the next day, what happens to him is his abdominal distension is worsening, tachypnea and retractions worsen, and shock persists. You can see that BP is just at fifth centile, which would have been otherwise acceptable, but he has tachycardia, weak pulses, CFT is prolonged. There is mild GI bleeding with 1 or 2 episodes of melena. Hemoglobin is 9.5. Admission hemoglobin was 14, so that means it has dropped. Platelets have also dropped. Coagulogram has worsened. So overall, there is worsening in multiple issues. So that means this, and the X-ray has also worsened. We can see that it's quite worse compared to the first X-ray on day one. So this means the issues that this child now has is persisting shock, worsening respiratory distress, a dropping hematocrit, and worsening thrombocytopenia. So once we have a child who's becoming refractory to what we are doing, one thing will always be fluids, because that is the root cause of the shock, one of the main causes of shock in dengue. So we continue with fluids, which can be NS or RL or colloid, 10 to 20 ml per kg with fluid boluses. Then we consider adding inotropes or pressors. This again depends on the systolic blood pressure and the diastolic blood pressure, what is the clinical response to the fluid, and what the echo shows. Consider putting a CVP line with great care when expertise is available, and consider stepping up respiratory support, nasal CPAP or ventilation, and consider measuring the intra-abdominal pressure and a very guarded drain if that would help. So this would be the approach for a refractory shock. It's very important to have a checklist of what all we need to see when shock is not responding to what we are doing. One, of course, is uncorrected hypovolemia itself. Also, hypocalcemia and hypoglycemia easily treatable. Two important issues: abdominal compartment syndrome and myocardial dysfunction. And of course, the situation can go worse once we intubate and give positive pressure ventilation. Coexisting bacterial septic shock and malaria are less common possibilities, and terminal vasoplegic shock. So it's very important to have this checklist so that we don't miss out on anything. So once we have maintained the fluid regimen and also given him blood, one question is there any role of steroids? So many studies in the 80s have shown no convincing benefit on mortality. There has been an RCT as well as a Cochrane review, which did not find sufficient evidence to give steroids in dengue. So coming to this child, he got a slow fluid bolus and IV fluids, both crystalloids and colloids. He was intubated and ventilated. The echocardiogram showed good contractility, and the IVC was distensible. He got packed cells, FFP, and platelets. We'll discuss this. He continued to have oozing from IV sites, but no major bleeding. So this means that this child is in this part of the figure where the unstable hemodynamics along with a low hematocrit means that he needs urgent blood transfusion, which he was given. So it's important to remember these clinical signs of significant hemorrhage other than hemodynamics: abdominal distension and or tenderness, leukocytosis instead of the leukopenia that is typically seen, and persisting acidosis. So especially occult bleed should be considered when the hematocrit looks deceptively normal for the degree of shock, where it actually should be high. Hemodynamics are suboptimal despite enough fluids or crystalloids or colloids, and persisting acidosis, especially with abdominal signs. So these are the signs of occult bleed, and we know that the internal bleeding may not become apparent for a long time till the first black stool is passed. Coming to the other two transfusions that he got, that is platelets and FFP, there's a nice review recently in 2017, which has assessed how effective are the many interventions that we use, including platelets, FFP, factor 7, anti-D, immunoglobulin, and interleukin level. Coming to platelet transfusions, there have been two RCTs, one from Pakistan, 2013, which showed that half of the patients did not even have increased in the platelet counts, and obviously no control of bleeding. The other one in 2017, a multi-center one, all adult patients with platelet counts of less than 20,000 without significant bleeding, like this child. Here also again, the rise in platelet count or the control of bleeds or clinical bleeds was similar. So this study concluded that prophylactic platelet transfusion is not superior to supportive care in preventing bleeding, and in fact may be associated with adverse events. Previous studies also showed the same, that there is no difference in clinical bleeding, mucosal bleeding, or internal bleeding, even when the platelet counts are below 20,000. Coming to fresh flows and plasma, again, one RCT and one retrospective study, which showed that platelet counts may increase transiently, but the ultimate outcome, there is no difference. And in fact, there is an increased risk of pulmonary edema by giving FFPs. Other therapies, which can be intravenous anti-D globulin, IVIG, recombinant factor 7A, IL-11, or tranexamic acid, have not been shown to be of any benefit in severe dengue to improve platelet counts or control bleeds. One interesting association between the consumption of ADAMTS13 and the role of FFP in plasma exchange, which is again controversial, we can discuss during the discussion. So coming to the, in a nutshell, the bleeding in dengue, the things to remember is mucosal bleeding may occur in any patient. If the patient is stable with fluids, it is considered to be minor, and this usually improves rapidly during the recovery phase. Minor GI bleeds and IV site bleeds. So these are all minor. When there is profound thrombocytopenia, ideally platelet transfusion will not help and should not be given. We just have to ensure strict bed rest, protect from trauma, and avoid IM injections. We just have to know which patients are at risk of major bleeding. For example, those who had refractory shock, renal or liver failure, and persistent metabolic acidosis. These are the patients whom we have to closely monitor and keep the interventions ready in case they do bleed significantly. So the same child who was admitted on day 1 with hypotensive shock, suppose on day 2, the scenario was like this, that is, the abdominal distension and the respiratory distress worsened, but hemodynamics seem to be fine. In fact, BP seems to be on the slightly higher side. He still has mild GI bleeding. Hemoglobin has dropped from 14 to 11, but everything else is as bad as it was. That is, platelets are 15,000 and coagulogram is deranged. So in this child, again, the X-ray was like this. So it's difficult to comment on the heart because it looks like a rotated film, but otherwise the lungs look quite bad. So this child was again intubated and ventilated, and the echo here, suppose it shows a dilated IVCN chambers with reduced contractility. This means that this child is here where the hemodynamics have stabilized and the hematocrit is falling. So instead of, it's like necessary to decrease and stop the fluids and avoid unnecessary transfusions. Probably that is what has pushed this child into fluid overload. So the causes for fluid overload are giving fluids either too much, too fast, or untimely fluids, unnecessary blood and blood products, giving fluids instead of blood, and chronic diseases. So it's very important to know when to decrease and stop fluids. And once there is fluid overload, we support the breathing with oxygen or with some positive pressure, either NIV or ventilation sometimes. Decrease and stop fluids, avoid diuretics, and sometimes we may need to resort to renal replacement therapy. Coming to some important organs that are involved, one important organ in almost all cases in some form is the cardiac involvement. Here, studies have shown that it is important to pick, other than the routine shock and myocardial dysfunction, even arrhythmias can occur, and an echocardiogram can be a good non-invasive procedure to screen for cardiac involvement. So summing up, it's very important to get the just enough fluids. To remember, target endpoints are different. Avoid prophylactic blood and blood products, and prompt cessation of IV fluids in the recovery phase. And many things which we routinely do in septic shocks are a double-edged sword. Each and everything of this is a double-edged sword. Recently, a paper has been published from Apollo Chennai, which has assessed the efficacy of a group of targeted interventions in critically ill children with severe dengue and has shown good outcomes, of course, like restrictive resuscitation and colloid rescue, monitoring intra-abdominal pressure and relieving it, respiratory support, and using CRRT. So all these will need more studies to replicate it in general and this specific population. So we know that many other organs can be involved, but are much less common, what is called as expanded dengue syndrome, including the uncommon complication of acute necrotizing encephalopathy of childhood or NIC, which will need a different line of therapy with steroids. AKI is multifactorial and most of the times follows a benign course. Occasionally, it may need renal replacement therapy. So there have been studies where up to 20% of children with severe dengue have developed AKI, and many of them have responded well to dialysis. And here again, the volume maintenance is the main thing to be targeted. We may give a trial of furosemide when the hemodynamics are stable, but it's important to always think of early RRT when it is required, especially when there is fluid overload. And again, the modality, there are not much studies which can recommend one over the other. We have to individualize depending on the age of the child, the clinical status, and the availability of expertise in the individual center. So cost, vascular access, and need for anticoagulation are important issues which will need to be kept in mind. Hyponatremia is common, hypokalemia is common, may or may not have an obvious cause. Proteinuria and microscopic hematuria are common abnormalities which are self-limited. Hepatitis as such is common. Degree of elevation of transaminases does not correlate with the severity of illness. And there is not enough evidence of N-acetylcysteine for dengue-induced liver failure, but it is something which is harmless and used in many units. An important complication which needs a different line of therapy is HLH, recognizing HLH and treating HLH. In one study of 212 children, 31 were suspected HLH and 23 had marrow evidence, and most of them improved well with IVIG. Another study showed that in infection-induced HLH, dengue is one of the commonest causes of infection-induced HLH. Lot of atypical manifestations described with dengue fever in children, and many of them may not be very common. A lot of other drugs have been studied recently: chloroquine, balapiravir, selgosivir, and lovastatin, but none of them have been proven to have any major effect. A trial of ivermectin is currently ongoing. So this, many of the previous speakers have already alluded to, the double trouble that we are facing with dengue and COVID-19. So the problem comes, COVID as such is not common in children, but MISC is quite common, and many of us are seeing cases. So the thing here is, in a COVID case, we may be more careful with the fluids, which are the cornerstone of dengue management. And again, anticoagulation, which is used much more rampantly in COVID, is almost like dangerous in dengue. And MISC has a completely different line of management, so it's very important to recognize early. So clinical overlap of signs and symptoms, even lab investigations may be similar, and a false positive IgM may be seen in confirmed COVID-19. All these add to the diagnostic dilemma. Important things which will suggest MISC will be the oral mucosal findings, CRP, which is a very simple and a cheap investigation which can be done at any hospital, anemia, and coronary artery abnormalities, though they may seem just in 8 to 10% of MISC cases, but once it is there, that clinches the diagnosis of MISC and needs immediate IVIG or steroids. This study also Dr. Karthi was mentioning, we have to see and await additional evidence whether children with severe dengue and exposure to SARS-CoV-2 in the past, will they have a less severe course? This is some thing which can be researched upon. So to conclude, dengue is a deadly infection. It has to be identified early and treated early and appropriately. It's important to remember the close mimics, not just COVID and MISC, but the other tropical infections like scrub typhus, which we have always seen. Always remember MISC whenever there is a child with suspected dengue, because many of the clinical and lab features may overlap, and the line of treatment is completely different. Some of the clinical features, a CRP and an early echocardiogram may be very helpful here. One thing about management of dengue is that it has to go hand in hand with the pathogenesis and the natural course of the disease. The outcome of dengue depends on giving fluids appropriately, and giving fluid appropriately needs meticulous clinical monitoring and monitoring the hematocrit. Prophylactic transfusions have no role, and just with basic clinical monitoring, we can improve the outcome even if the setting is not a tertiary care setting. And of course, we need to remember the red flag signs where we need to immediately refer the child to a tertiary care center also. So thank you so much for the opportunity, and we can discuss the questions if there are any.
Thank you, Madhu. Thanks. It's wonderful and for the comprehensive talk covering everything about severe dengue in 25 minutes. So we have, if there is any questions, we will take. Otherwise, we can discuss for probably 10 minutes. And there is another question by Dr. Sendil. Role of BSS in severe dengue. Sir, what do you mean by BSS?
Balanced salt solutions. I think he is referring to that.
Okay, solutions, balance. You want to answer, Madhu?
Yeah. I'm not sure
Madhu,
if.
can you stop sharing the slide?
Slide, please.
6. How do I do that? Okay.
Sir, there is a question and answer session. Question and answer. There is a chat box. We are having questions.
Pardon?
In
Three
Q&A, we have
questions.
questions.
Q&A, there is a
3 questions are in the Q&A.
Oh, okay. We'll answer this and then we'll go there. And the balance solution you want to answer, Madhu?
Yeah, I'm not sure if specifically in dengue this has been studied, but in septic shock or DK, for example, some studies have shown that because of a lesser chloride load, the incidence of AKI is higher, but mortality-wise, I don't think we have much data there also. I think the other sir and the other panelists can add to this.
Yeah, there is. I don't think there is some studies comparing. Yes, there is saline versus colloid, crystalloid studies are there. And balanced solution in dengue, I'm not aware of that. But any other comments from the panelists?
Sir, balanced salt solution in dengue, as you told, there is no published studies. There are some thesis level done, but there are no great signal to say that balanced salt solution need to be preferred. On a broader spectrum, if you go into the studies which is available in DKA or in septic shock, that itself, the recent one, the basic study. So the critical care fellows who are attending can go and review the basic study, which is the most recent one. Brazilian study published, and it is an adult study. But even that is saying balanced salt solution is not greatly reducing the acute kidney injury or hyperchloremic acidosis. So the balanced salt solution promotion itself, we can't promote it as a greater thing, and we can't say that it is a best option, even in septic shock and decay. So the thing is only neutral.
Right.
So in dengue, not even studies. So we can't even.
So even that hyperchloremic acidosis and AK association is questioned probably now, right? So, okay. So we'll move on to the next as volume of colloids to be used per day. Total volume of colloids per day in children. Is there a cap? Volume of colloids to be used. So he mentioned about that colloids to be individualized in severe dengue. All the studies have proven clinical trials, there is no the mortality or survival rate different. Madhu?
Yeah, I don't think if there is an upper limit to use it, it will depend completely on the clinical situation. In fact, like we are worried about giving too much. It's like important to just to get it right and not to give too much, especially colloids. So there can't be an upper limit. It has to be individualized.
Rate of fluid administration in optimization phase. So we have the guidelines. WHO says about the further warning signs and thing. In severe dengue,
So,
Madhu?
sorry, sir.
Rate of fluid administration in optimization phase. So they are comparing it with like a septic shock, probably, like in severe dengue shock. How do you manage?
So
It is not
that's
about
as I
other
said,
things.
like it's completely a dynamic situation. That's what makes it so difficult. And even after a few hours, an apparently improving patient can crash. I mean, that is the main thing about dengue. So it has to be like hour by hour with all your clinical monitoring and better not to fix to numbers. I mean, even though WHO says 7, 10, 5, I think we just need to, whether we are increasing, decreasing, how much the child needs, that is more important, I feel.
Yeah, absolutely. He put it in his first phase of the first case scenario. As you correctly said, the course is dynamical and sometimes unpredictable. But only thing is meticulous monitoring. So you mentioned aim for a minimum acceptable circulating volume. So that is how do we find it out? So just clinical parameters and the urine output you need to measure. Somebody says like urine output is a poor man CVP. Probably you aim to have a 0.5 ml per kg to 1 ml. You mentioned that also. If it is more than 1.5 ml, 2 ml, probably it is an early indicator that you are giving more volume. So
Yeah,
that
exactly.
probably is very important to take home message. Is individualizing, monitoring is important.
Can I have a question?
Yes, please.
You clearly mentioned that it is only you have to assess depending on that. There's no fixed number, but practically I need a fixed number. For example, before starting an epinephrine infusion, we give 20 ml or 30 ml or 40 ml. But earlier we used to give up to 60 ml about 10-15 years ago. Now the volume has been reduced now. At least the minimum amount of fluid to be given before switching to inotropes.
So that you are asking
how much generally we give in the correction of shock, we start with the fluids. How much probably beyond which better not to give more fluids like 30 ml or 40 ml like that.
But I'm not very sure in dengue. We follow the WHO guidelines, right, sir? Now, in compensated shock also they mentioned 10.
WHO gives large amount of fluids. No, now we are reducing the amount of fluid.
Correct.
Generally, no, that is a general doubt everybody will like to have.
Absolutely. See, we also don't know. We are doing. I'll just probably, since you asked, I'm just putting it out. We are doing one study comparing with ICMR the dengue in moderate shock. That means with warning signs as well as compensated phase. Severe dengue is out. So one side WHO protocol, the other one we are putting something like our arbitrary number. We have come out with like dehydration fluid, like 30 ml per kg over 6 hours or 4 hours. So we calculated, and then we are saying that minimum amount should be enough. And it is not inferior to what the WHO says. Probably that maybe at the end of the study, we need to say, okay, we can give 30 ml per kg over 4 hours, probably enough for, to say, a compensated shock. So at this point, I'm not sure. And then, but if it goes into severe shock, so the child you have received 10 ml per kg or 20 ml per kg, and this still child requires more volume, probably I would consider, in my issue, colloids at that point in time. Not to give too much of crystalloids, giving 40 ml per kg, 50 ml, 60 ml. So it may be difficult to assess with your ultrasound. Already tummy is big. So you may not be able to give your IVC or your passive leg rexing. That and all will not help here at all. So probably that after over 30 ml per kg to 40 maximum probably, I will switch on to a colloid over time, 1 or 2 hours. And then I will assess the urine output and then decide, take it from there. Others, anybody?
So she wants to.
Sir, I thought it's better not to take.
So the discussion will go on, right?
So I think we have so much of heterogeneity.
Yes.
Actually, the perspective of science is whenever we have so much heterogeneity in practice, obviously we have to convert it into a research because the answer is yet not sure. So what we need to understand is we do not have answer. There is a huge heterogeneity in practice pattern, but there is a huge opponent group. I can say that there is a huge opponent group saying that this 40, 50, 60 ml per kg at least is not seemingly required. And going down 10 ml, then 7 ml, then 5 ml, then going to 100% maintenance, then going to 70%, 80% also doesn't seem to be more logical. So that's why there are huge heterogeneity in practice pattern, and every one of us practicing from completely different places. For example, for us, if we are going beyond 20 or 20 ml per kg crystalloid, we give colloid, always albumin. But that's not possible everywhere. Albumin is costly.
That's true. Yeah.
So obviously tweaking of protocols may be needed. And when the heterogeneity is so universal, we need more pragmatic studies.
You're correct, absolutely. But we need to consider this fluid overload can be an increase in mortality that we need to be aware of. The next question is bleeding risk of invasive blood pressure measurement in hypotensive dengue patients. Madhu, you would like to answer? So we say non-invasive, probably in a critical phase, may not be adequately translate to a correct measurement of blood pressure. So we tend to put arterial blood pressure, that is right. But in dengue, severe dengue, what is your take?
This is a very important point what sir just said, that many times we just keep following the non-invasive blood pressure values, and they may be, especially with that edema and different age groups, and it may be fallacious. I personally have not seen significant bleeding just by using an intra-arterial line. So this, I think we should not be hesitating in a sick child when we are able to get a reliable BP. That is important, because we just don't want that is an important, just getting the 5th centile BP is fine. So that way, that's an important thing to monitor without significant complications. So that is something that can be done.
Yeah. All right. Then one more question is there about maximum volume of blood products to be infused. Probably this opens up the requirement of platelet, FFP, and all your whole blood versus packed cells also. Madhu, you would like to just talk about that for 1 minute, and then
Again, volume wise, I don't know whether there's any fixed number to it. Definitely, probably we give more infusions than needed. I mean, going by the evidence, because even prophylactic platelets are not recommended even below 20,000 when there are no major bleeds, FFP, for example. And so that way we may be giving more transfusions, and I don't know if there's any fixed number.
I don't think there is
beyond
a
which,
thing, but there is no prophylactic blood products. That we have to give the correct message. So whether the so now the question will come, do you have a target? Now the platelets is 4,000. There is no clinical bleeding. Do I have to give platelets?
Ideally, no.
No, ideally no. Keep the child and observe probably. But we are very hesitant to do that. We tend to pump it with platelets. And then another theory comes, hypothesis that ADAM-TS13 is deficient. So you give FFP, replenish ADAM-TS13, and then only give the platelets. Otherwise, microthrombi will form and multi-organ failure. So we give more volume by giving that FFP, platelets. And finally, your hemoglobin is dropping, you give Paxil. That's the exact question Dr. Muthurama Subramaniam is asking, how much I can give. So the answer probably will be to restrain ourselves. It probably most of the time, it's for our mental satisfaction, we are giving if there is no clinical bleeding. If there is a minor clinical bleeding with less than 10,000 platelets, probably I will tend to give in my unit if there is some bleeding with less than 10,000. Or if I am planning to put a central line, yes. In that circumstance, in CMC, in our unit, we follow this. We believe in this theory because it's one of our hepatologists is putting forth a lot of papers on this, Dr. Eapen. So we give FFP and then followed by platelets. But we restrict that. If it is really there is bleeding, or if you really want to put a central line somewhere, which is necessary to be given something.
Another question from Professor Ramchandran. What is the colloid of choice? Once you decide to give colloids, what is the colloid of choice if used?
Colloid of choice is albumin. Is it 5% or 20%? If there is 20%, probably if you are planning to give it over 2 to 4 hours like that, maybe 1 gram per kg as 20% albumin. Or if you want to give it quickly, it is 5% albumin, I think so. What, Sasi and Madhu?
Yes, sir, I agree.
What, Madhu?
Yes, sir, I agree with that. Like 5% albumin is the one usually given.
Yeah.
So
unless you give it over hours as an infusion, 20%.
All colloid studies used 4% albumin predominantly from ANSIX group. So 4% albumin is not available here. So equivalent choice we take it as 5% albumin. So 20% albumin being an alternate, we have to understand that it is a borrowed evidence. There's no direct evidence with 20% albumin. It is a highly osmotic when it is 20% albumin. So we have to be extremely careful about the rate of infusion.
Correct.
So I just wanted to highlight that the rate of infusion, you have to be extremely cautious. If you are giving 20% albumin, especially in a child who is having a respiratory distress.
Absolutely, you're right. So if you want to give it for like 4 hours, like 6 to 8 hours, probably might. Otherwise, 5%. And there is another question about intubating a dengue child when it worsens. It's a nightmare probably when you have to intubate a severe dengue. Madhu?
Yeah, so lot of things. I mean, like we need to be clear of the reason for indication and whether we can just tide over with NIV. That is one thing. And once we do intubate, again, it's like a physiologically unstable airway where, again, fluids, we have to be careful. There is a risk of overload by pushing in more boluses also. But again, a shock should not precipitously fall in BPs and may be difficult to control once it happens during intubation with all that sedation and all that. So we need to keep some rate of fluid going on, keep a pressor ready if it is needed, be prepared for an arrest, especially in a sick child with acidosis. So a lot of things.
So this is what they talk about, the physiological difficult airway with hypotension, acidosis, and coagulopathy and bleeding there. So probably, as he said, maybe a vasoactive agent like adrenaline on board, prepare for everything, and then put on one attempt and then should be there. So that there's some, what is the HOP triad or something and all they talk like physiological difficult airway. And in this context, probably maybe we can highlight the stopping the bleeding. Hemostasis is very important. If there is anywhere some bleeding happens, so oral or mucosal tranexaminic acid with adrenaline. What do you have? You have any experience, Madhu? If there is gum bleed, bleeding, mucosal bleeding.
Yeah, we do use it, but I couldn't come across any studies which actually support its efficacy. We do use it. Yes.
And put that, but it's because stopping the bleeding is very, very important. Some equate it with the source reduction in septic shock, right? So we had to, I think Suchitra has always quoted it, talk probably, this source reduction septic shock like hemostasis has to be done appropriately.
Like adolescent girls coming with menstrual bleed also, there is one.
Yeah,
that's tranexamic acid is used.
Yeah. And then you talked about persistent shock. You need to consider a compartmental abdominal compartment and myocardial dysfunction, right? How do we find out that, Madhu? If the shock is persisting, you mentioned three things. It may be an occult bleed, it can be myocardial dysfunction, or it can be abdominal pressure causing it.
Occult bleed, as I said, it's important to recognize the clinical signs and the drop in hematocrit or the hematocrit which is inappropriate to the level of shock. And there we may not actually get any other evidence of bleed, and we may resort to a blood transfusion to improve the shock. And myocardial dysfunction, obviously the best thing to do would be an echo, a bedside echo, which is non-invasive. Intra-abdominal hypertension is something which can be measured and if necessary, even treated. So this is
so intra-abdominal pressure and your organ involvement is there, AKA. Now, which renal replacement? We had a 12 years old boy last weekend with severe dengue, with his crashing, we had to intubate. His abdominal pressure was around 20. So right at 2 o'clock, we had a debate. CRR, they are well to do. CRRT versus PD. So
PD may actually...
Sir, we have another presentation, sir.
Okay, that will stop.
Sir,
but looks like Madhusudan is facing a viva.
because this question has a most complicated answer, and which will open up a very big Pandora box. So we won't even end by midnight.
But anyway, last week, what I did, I'll just tell. We had a real discussion, and we put with the risk and put the PD. So the PD worked really amazing. The child really got, but he's still on a ventilator, but he's improved that shock part and AK, everything is improved. But we have to take a probability. He might bleed. We don't know.
Yes.
So because that is the one thing. And we'll stop with that probably. Otherwise, if you ask for plasma exchange, hyperferritinemia, so the discussion will go on. Yeah, Madhu? It may not be much useful for others. Any other question from the audience?
I can see some in the chat.
There are some questions probably we can answer in the chat box.
Yeah, we can answer the Q&A box as well.
There are two more questions in the chat box. Probably you can type and answer it.
Okay.
treatment of fluid overload. That's what we are discussing. Probably we can type it there. All right. Thank you, Madhu.
Thank you.
and
Thank you so
for a
much, sir.
wonderful discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ebar and Dr. Madhusudan, for a wonderful talk and further discussion, of course, about that discussions.
Thank you so much.
We'll move on to the next session.
Sorry for the reason for aborting, sir. This is just a time control.
Yeah. Right.
Thank you, but we'll move on to the next session. Next section is quite interesting. Status epilepticus, very commonly encountered in every place. And the team is, the speaker is Dr. Srinivasan and the moderator is Dr. Puri. Both have their unique and first in their own respect. He's the first DMPD in public sector hospitals, Dr. Srinivasan. And Puri is the first PhD in diabetes in public sector hospital. With this, I'll introduce Dr. Puri. She is currently Professor of Pediatrics and Professor of Pediatric Intensive Care in a very high busy unit in Institute of Child at Madras Medical College. She received many awards, including Active Pediatrician Award by APTNSC, Best Doctor Award from Tamil Nadu Dr. MGR Medical University. This is one of the very few persons who are involved in a lot of research despite in a busy unit in a public sector hospital. The economic cost of dengue in India, genetics of type 1 diabetes, hospital-based surveillance study on bacterial meningitis, national hospital-based rotavirus surveillance network, research on MAS in children. These are few of the studies in which she's being involved. She has multiple publications, presented papers in various national and international conferences, 75 publications from various national and international journals, authored chapters in undergraduate and postgraduate textbooks in pediatrics in both infectious